I am Jeff Lowenfels. Welcome. Nice to see you. It's awfully hot here in Florida. As an Alaskan, I don't appreciate this that much, but I'm sure many people do. I am the author of Teaming with Microbes, and I hope I can get this to work. I guess you have to put it on play before we do that. There we go. Let's see. All right. Now, a lot of people don't know who I am, but a lot of people in the gardening world know this guy. That's Roger Swain. He had a TV show, Victory Garden. And it turns out that Roger and I went to college together, and I like to tell people that 2% of the class of 1975, Harvard University, became garden writers. Not 1975, actually, it was 1971. I like to lie about my age. But anyway, one of them became very successful, and the other one is here in front of you today. I've got 3 books, as Steve mentioned, the third one coming out in January. I used to be, because I'm a lawyer, known as America's dirtiest lawyer, so the idea of now becoming Lord of the Roots is a little bit more attractive to me. And there it is, of course. What happens to this machine? I don't know. Yeah, isn't that a nice tree? Okay, so Lord of the Roots, there we go. When I first started gardening, nobody owned their own telephone, and I better turn mine off, and I hope you turn yours off as well. Nobody owned their own telephone. All the telephones were black. They were attached to the wall in the house, and when you moved, the phone stayed there. There were thousands of different magazines, a lot of print stuff, and even magazines on gardening. Lots of good gardening magazines back then. There was aluminum foil invented. I should go back to that. Plastic was invented. We ate plastic. We played with plastic. It was all over the place. And new fertilizers were developed, and these were going to save the world. They were spectacular, and we learned how to spray our food so we wouldn't have any blemishes on them. Instant coffee was invented. You know, it was a time that actually had a television show with a slogan called Better Living Through Chemistry. And that's what they tried to describe as the era when I was growing up, Better Living Through Chemistry. There's Mr. Wizard. He ran the show, and he had this little dweeby assistant with him. And like many people in my generation, she took chemistry a little bit too far as she got a little bit older. But anyway, things have changed since then. Today, we don't have aluminum foil. We have microwaves that don't use aluminum foil. This is a TV dinner without aluminum foil. This is our instant coffee. We all own our own telephones, and inside the telephone is every magazine and newspaper you could ever possibly want, all the television you could possibly want. It's a great thing because we can get information anytime and any place we want it. This used to be a unique picture. This is what they have in all the airports now. Anyway, it's 2016, and you know, it's funny because we're still using the same fertilizer, we're still spraying our food, we're stuck. We're just absolutely stuck. And the reason, one of the reasons anyway, is because there are lots of advertisements telling us how to live and what to do. And one of the big advertisers tells us how to garden. And how to farm, I might add, and other things as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this as we go on. I was a very big proponent of gardening with anything you wanted to garden with. If you wanted to use chemicals, I didn't care. If you wanted to be organic, I didn't care. And I used to go to the Garden Writers of America convention and argue with my fellow garden writers that there was no difference between organic gardening and chemical gardening. Because nitrogen is nitrogen on the periodic table. A plant doesn't care whether it comes in a brown manure or a green powder. It's nitrogen. And I would challenge my fellow garden writers to convince me that I was wrong. And they couldn't. They tried, but they couldn't. And then one day, about 20 years after starting this, a friend of mine sent me this picture over the internet. Late at night, I opened it up and I looked at it. He had the words, "The soil food web," attached to the top. "You lose," on the bottom. That was it. And I could not figure out what I was looking at, so I spent quite a bit of time on the internet trying to figure out what the soil food web was, what I was looking at, and why I lost. Now, my wife was gone getting a degree someplace on the East Coast, and so I had a lot of time, and I literally spent about 48 hours on the internet until I figured out that what I was looking at here, what you're looking at here, is a nematode. A nematode's a blind worm, about the size of a hair or smaller, and they travel in the soil at a temperature gradient where they hit the food that they're going to eat. So they know where basically to go. This particular critter was in the soil, traveling around at the right temperature gradient, heading towards the tomato root when he or she smelled a delicious smell and dove into the first lifesaver there and the second lifesaver there. There isn't. And when it hit those two lifesavers, a funny thing happened. They filled up with water and strangled that nematode. Whoa, that blew me away when I figured that out. That's amazing. But what was even more amazing is that thing with those two little lifesavers on it is a single fungal hyphae. And that fungal hyphae is protecting that white spot below, which is the tomato root, from nematodes. Blew me away. I'd never seen a microscopic picture like this. This is an electron microscope picture. I didn't have any idea that fungi acted this way, and I didn't even know nematodes were blind for that matter. But why did I lose? What was this all about? Obviously, it had something to do with the soil food web, and so I started looking for the soil food web on the internet, and I kept coming across diagrams like this, which made no sense to me whatsoever, with words on it that I had no idea, like mycorrhizal. What was that? And finally, I came upon a picture, and I could figure out what was going on. And this picture could describe the entire talk here. I could give the whole talk off this picture. I won't. This is the soil food web. A soil food web is nothing more than a series of chains, food chains. The little guy gets eaten by the bigger guy, gets eaten by the bigger guy, that are in the soil. And there's thousands and thousands and millions of these in the soil. And every now and then, something on one of the chains looks up or looks down and sees another chain and eats something off of that other chain and connects all those chains together into a gigantic web of who eats whom in the soil. That's the soil food web. And it starts with the plant. The plant takes about 50 to 60% of its photosynthetic energy and produces things that drip out of the root system called exudates, not energy used for tomato or flower or for green leaf, for things that drip out of the roots called exudates. You're exudating right now. Sweat is exudate. And your sweat does the same thing that these exudates do. These exudates attract bacteria and fungus to the root system of the plants. They're designed to feed bacteria and fungus. And the bacteria and fungus live in the root system, in the rhizosphere, right around the root, eating these exudates, having a great time. And along come nematodes, which I just showed you a picture of, and protozoa, which you studied in high school, and they eat the bacteria and the fungi. And they eat them because they need carbon. The bacteria and fungi are eating the exudates because they have carbon in them. So it's a carbon-based system. And when the nematodes and the protozoa finish eating, they digest the carbon and what little else they need, and they poop out the rest, right there in the rhizosphere, right next to the roots, and these poops contain plant-usable foods, like nitrogen in plant-usable form. Wow, pretty amazing. And then, of course, you got the bigger guys that eat the protozoa and the nematodes, and bigger guys eat those, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the soil food web. And that's how it works. So what I'm going to do now is give you a very short course on the soil food web. And I always tell people when I do this course, don't take notes. Don't take notes. Don't use your computer. And the reason I say that is twofold. One, you'll understand it by the time I finish, I promise you. And two, there's a perfectly good book that has everything you need to know about the soil food web in it, and you can get the book instead. So pay attention here. You don't need to be taking notes. Let me just entertain you and try to teach you without you having to write anything down. And by the way, if you happen to speak Korean or French or Slovakian or Dutch, a couple of other languages, the book's available in those as well. Now, I don't have an electron microscope. I don't have a wonderful camera like we had in the film this morning. So you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit and look at this soil food web through my weird eyes, okay? And let's start by, let's go underground, I guess, first, and take a look what's down there. This is a plant, a tree, right out here in front of the hotel. This is the root system of that tree, and this tree is sitting there on a Friday afternoon. It's been a tough week. A lot of kids have been coming to Disneyland, and a lot of adults going to Epcot, and they've been stepping on this tree's roots, and the tree says, I am starved, and I want something different to eat. I would like I'd like some Japanese food tonight. And so what does it do? It produces an exudate and drips it out of the root system, and the next thing you know, it attracts Japanese bacteria. Simple as that. The plant is in control, not you, the gardener. And if it wanted American food, all it has to do is change the exudate, and bingo, American food. Simple as that. The plant's in control, and it can change these exudates to serve it. Now, plants can't run around, but they can do things that we don't realize, and this is one of them. French food, change the exudate. Simple as that. It's really a basic way that plants operate. All right, now, the plant's in full control, and these exudates are attracting the food system that it needs to get, but it's also attracting great numbers and high diversity. And this is important because diversity is what protects us. You know, the numbers and the diversity protect us. If we were all alike, you know, all alligators, and one of us was a little chick, you know, not good things would happen. But if there's diversity here, you know, we can protect ourselves, and that's what happens. And some of the things that these exudates do are absolutely amazing, and we're discovering new things all the time. So what you're looking at here now is a root system. This is a picture that was taken about 2 years ago when they made this discovery. That white stuff, that's exudate. And that particular exudate acts exactly like your white blood cells. It's xDNA. And it goes out into the soil and does different things. In this particular instance, it goes out into the soil and it ties up heavy metals that the plant can't handle and that you don't want in your plants. It ties them up so that they can't get in the plant. Wow, who knew? I can tell you up until 2 years ago, nobody. And we're discovering new things all the time about these exudates that are coming out. They're basically carbon. They have some protein and sometimes vitamin D3 kind of molecules in them. Picture in the wrong spot, so just forget about this for a second. That's a Berlese funnel, which I will mention in a couple of minutes, so just take a look at that. These bacteria in a teaspoon of soil, there are about 600 million. You know, this is almost even worth doing this. I'm going to do something I don't normally do because a couple of pictures were left out, and I think they're worth keeping in. And so I'm going to put them back, both of them. Just wanted you to know, you know, okay, don't skip that slide, and let's not skip this slide either. Okay. All right, let's go back here, and let's hit play again. All right, so in a teaspoon of soil, there are 500 million to 1 trillion bacteria, okay? When I wrote the first edition of this book, I said bacteria, and that was it. Then they discovered about 2 years after the book came out that, in fact, that 500 million to 1 trillion bacteria contained an unknown quantity of something called archaea. Now, I'd never heard of archaea. And I never heard of archaea because I graduated from college in 1971. They were discovered in 1978. They look just like bacteria, but they have a different cell wall composition. They turn out to be the third branch of life. Who knew? Third branch of life. We used to think they were just in geysers and volcanic, real extreme situations. Then we discovered that they're the dominant form of life in the oceans. And then discovered that they're the dominant form of life in the second step of the two-step nitrogen fixing process. So they're very, very important. Nobody's ever heard of them. They're called archaea, a new form of life discovered in 1978. And so now there are 3 domains of life. One of them happens to be archaea. But not to be surprised, because we're discovering new life forms all the time. I like to just stick that in there. And actually, just to be fair, we'll do Hillary too, new life forms all the time. All right, here's that Berlese funnel again, which I got in the wrong spot, but I'm going to tell you, a Berlese funnel is made by taking a pop bottle and cutting it in half and sticking the pop bottle half inside itself. And we're going to talk again more about that in a little bit later on. But let's go back to these bacteria and archaea, because what they do in the soil food web is they eat simple things. They digest simple things, sugars. There are lots of these long, complex carbon chains. These guys nibble at the edges of them. So they break down simple things. And they eat and they eat and they breed and breed. I can't show you the breeding pictures because it's a mixed audience, but you take 2 of these guys, you put them in a petri dish with ideal conditions, and you end up with 6 feet of bacterium all over the earth in about, 8 weeks, something like that. They eat and breed. That's what they do. We water our plants in part Because the microbes in this root system need to be wet. They need water. And there's some really spectacular looking bacteria that are in the soil food web. These happen to be called actinomycetes. We get a lot of our medicines from these. This is one of the reasons why people are worried about antibiotic resistance, because these produced antibiotics, they come from the soil, and they're absolutely spectacular. They also produce the wonderful smell that you get from compost. Geosyn is the stuff that they make. There are some called rhizobia that fix nitrogen. These are nitrogen-fixing bacteria, very, very important. And some of those actinomycetes also fix nitrogen in a form called Frankia. Most people have never heard of them, but you can buy rhizobia now and use them on your crops, and you're going to be able to buy Frankia without question in the next 5 or 10 years because people are beginning to work on them. They are used in pioneering situations. They're found in Australia, they're found in Alaska. Any place where there's new growth happening, that's what pops up. Now, these bacteria and archaea do something that is very strange. They form a slime, and they form a slime in order to protect themselves. They stick together, and the slime covers them so that the things that eat them have trouble getting at them. Okay? And so they've got this protective slime. Well, this slime, and incidentally, you all know what this slime is, because when you wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth to get rid of it, right? You're all licking your teeth right now. It happens every time I give this lecture. And you have to use a lot of energy to get rid of that slime. It's very, very strong, holding these billions and billions of bacteria together. And it turns out that this slime has a pH above 7. So that if you've got soil that is bacterially dominated, then the pH is going to be above 7. It's alkaline. And there are good bacteria and archaea and bad bacteria and archaea. And the bad guys, they come out when things become opportunistic. When things become just right, they appear out of nowhere. Now, in that teaspoon of soil, there are 14 feet of invisible fungal hyphae, like the one we saw there protecting that tomato root. 14 feet of invisible fungal hyphae. Now, these guys are not able to produce their own carbon like plants can and some bacteria can. Let's get rid of the jokes about fungi and all that kind of stuff. They're absolutely spectacular, and as a result of what I've learned, they contain chitin in their bodies. And this chitin enables them to protect plants in a way that'll become clear later on. So they have chitin in their bodies, a different cell wall, chitin, same thing that's in lobsters and crabs, than plants have. So we used to think they were plants without chlorophyll, but they're very, very different from plants. They're much more related to animals. And they weave through the soil as they grow towards their food sources. And when the soil consists of stuck together by bacterial slime clumps, they weave them together into particles. And these particles are not woven together bricks. They're particles of irregular size shaped things. And so you end up with soil structure from the bacteria and the fungi. And there are pores and holes in this soil which enable the little guys to hide from the bigger guys. When it rains, the rain pushes out the bad air. These act as reservoirs for water and hold in water. In fact, there's a film throughout soil particles that covers every little bit of the soil. And it absolutely is crucial to soil structure to have these fungi and bacteria. And I can tell you as a garden writer that up until I started researching this book, I had absolutely no idea how important bacteria and fungi were, just to soil structure alone, nonetheless the other parts of the soil food web. These fungi weave together these complicated webs called mycelium. They travel throughout the soil in search of food, and these mycelium hold together soil. Some of them hollow out and become what's known as rhizomorphs, and water can travel through them like pipelines. Great distances. They're absolutely spectacular, and again, part of the third book. Now, normally I would carry this around. What I usually do is I take a handful of good Alaskan soil, I throw it into a yogurt cup or a little plastic container with a handful of dried baby oatmeal, and I mix it up. I put it in my furnace room. I wipe off the excess moisture off the lid every night for 2 or 3 days, and I end up with a sponge that looks like this. Those are individual fungal hyphae that have woven together, millions and millions of them, to form these white threads. And what you've got there is a block of soil that I used to take with me, and I would hand it out here. It would go all the way around the room, come back here, and still be exactly the same shape. I could drop it on the floor and pick it up because the structure that the bacteria and the fungi gave it. I don't carry it around anymore because the TSA used to look at it and sniff it up, and all the spores would go in their noses, and that's why they're crazy today. But anyway, so I don't carry it around, but it's absolutely unbelievable, and you can try this yourself. You can see the fungus in your soil. And when you do, you go, whoa, who knew? Absolutely amazing. Now, these fungi can't make their own carbon, so they travel to the carbon, and the way they get their carbon is by dripping out acids from their bodies. And those acids break down things, and then they absorb that stuff into their bodies, and that's how they eat. So it's extracellular digestion and absorption. Okay. And when they drip those acids out, they're dripping out acids, which is the opposite of alkaline material. And so if you have soils that are dominated by fungi, and soils are usually either dominated by fungi or bacteria, if you have it dominated by fungi, the pH is below 7. Above 7, dominated by bacteria because of the slime, below 7 because of the acids that are dripped out by these fungi. And that's where pH, much of it comes from in the soil. Now, these fungi, they break down difficult molecules. They can break down, the middle of these long carbon chains, and when they do that, they digest stuff, but they then make edges available for the bacteria that are also in the soil. So they break down difficult to break things. This is a single fungal hyphae in the middle there, drilling into rock to get some phosphate. So they're very powerful acids, and they're everywhere. There are fungi in all plants, in the plants themselves. Above ground, they're called endophytic fungi. And when you get them and you put them on a petri dish and grow them, they make some beautiful patterns. Every single plant on the face of the earth, in the oceans, on land, has at least one endophytic fungi. Most of them have over 300. You probably have never heard of endophytic fungi. It's a fungi, for example, that might get into grass. It just lives in the grass. It doesn't hurt the grass. When the grass dies, the fungi can maybe eat the dead grass. But it's not a symbiotic relationship, but it's not a pathological one either. And it turns out that in some instances, it produces a substance, an acid, that things don't like to graze on. So insects won't eat it, nor will some cattle. So we're beginning to figure out that these have some pretty interesting powers, and we're beginning to study endophytic fungi, again, for use for various different things, health, gardening, etc. So you'll be hearing more about them. And then we have mycorrhizal fungi, which I think are so important that I wrote a third book on. I actually took my first book and got a second edition by adding a chapter on them, and then 3 years later, so much was discovered about mycorrhizal fungi that it became worthy of an entire book. Mycorrhizal fungi I'll talk about later, but they form a symbiotic relationship with plants and bring food to the plant in return for specialized exudates. So they're really kind of cool. Now, in a teaspoon of soil with those billion, trillion bacteria, 14 feet of invisible fungal hyphae, several thousand protozoa. Now, what's a protozoa? You all studied protozoa in high school. Everybody know what this is? You sure studied it. It's a paramecium. You had to take home the diagram of a shoe, with a gullet in it, and you had to label it. Parameciums will eat 10,000 bacteria a day and poop out the excess. So they're recyclers. They're fertilizer spreaders. This is a picture of what they look like today under the modern microscopes. The reason why you studied them in high school was because you could see them in the microscope. Bacteria you could not. But nobody ever told you why. Here's an amoeba. Everybody always said they saw these in high school, but nobody ever did. This is what they look like today under an electron microscope. Very different. This is a nematode. Nematodes are true worms. They have mouths, they have digestive systems, anus, the whole bit. The difference between nematodes are the mouth parts, okay? And incidentally, I don't want to freak anybody out, but if you all disappeared instantly, don't, but if you did, and the tables and the chairs and everything in here disappeared instantly, the shapes of everything, including you, would be here, I'm told, because of the nematodes that cover everything. So if you're a little bit squeamish about, things that have different kinds of mouth parts that are kind of scary, don't look at these next few things, because you're covered with nematodes. Like this guy. Look at this. Oh my God. Looks like a drill bit. That's not a drill bit. Those are just rubber spatulas. And it waves water that contain bacteria into the mouths of the nematode, so it's harmless. Now this one, on the other hand, that's a little needle, and it punches it into things where it can suck out the cytoplasm like other fungi or other nematodes. This is one, I think that may be hookworms. This one attacks dogs. There are lots of different kinds of nematodes, and you're covered with them. And sometimes in gardening, they're bad. They'll get into a root and cause these things, and then they'll start to, eat out the root and kill the plant. Simple as that. There are some good nematodes too, however. This particular one is now available for sale in England. I think it may be for sale here now. It's a heat seeker for slugs. And so you put it in the soil and it finds a slug and it just jumps into the back of the slug, drills in it, lays eggs, brings in bacteria with them, kills the slugs, and then jumps out with some of the bacteria to go get the rest of the slugs. So kind of interesting. Now this is a root in the rhizosphere. And I show this picture because I want to show you that the exudates create this activity of life. And why? Because soil is inherently low in carbon. A good farm might have 5% carbon in the soil, and that'd be a really good farm. Most have about 2%, and that's a good farm too. And the carbon is very rich around these roots because these exudates contain carbon, and so it attracts tremendous amounts of microbiology. So this is what's going on in the soil, at a very, very microscopic level. You have, nematodes and bacteria and protozoa eating the bacteria and the fungi and pooping out the excess to feed plants. Now this poop is always in the form of nitrogen, no matter what it comes from. It's always ammonium, okay, NH4, you know what that smells like, always in ammonium form. Now if the soil happens to be fungally dominated, that means it's got a lot of fungal acids in it, then it stays as ammonium. And why does it stay as ammonium? Because there are very few nitrogen-fixing bacteria in acidic soil. But if the soil is above 7 in pH, it has bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and it turns the ammonia into nitrate. So there's two kinds of nitrogen that plants like. Two kinds of nitrogen. I had no idea as America's longest running garden columnist that was true, nor did any of my garden writers. And it turns out that some plants prefer one kind of nitrogen over the other kind of nitrogen. And what that means is that you get a healthier plant if you grow it with the right kind of nitrogen. So the key for everybody is to figure out what nitrogen do your plants like. And one way to do it is just take a look at the succession level, and you can start at the beach and go all the way out to the old growth forest. What happens is the bacteria numbers basically stay the same the whole time. But as you get more and more material developing where there's detritus for the fungus to eat, they move in. And so by the time you get to the old growth forest, it's 50,000 more fungal to bacteria. It's completely the opposite at the other end. So what you do is you figure out where your strawberry fits along this line, and you know what kind of nitrogen. No, it's impossible to do. So this is the system that you should be using. Oh my gosh, how did that happen? Well, let's see if this works. This machine has a mind of its own. So, if you have things that are in the ground for less than a year, and that would be bulbs, because they produce a new bulb every year, annuals, row crops, your vegetables, they like bacterially dominated soil because they like the nitrate nitrogen. If you have things that are in the ground for more than a year, then they like the ammonium type nitrogen, trees and shrubs, and then it turns out that lawns like a little bit of half and half. Simple as that. So that's how you can figure it all out. It's very, very simple. And those are the little guys that make the base of the soil food web. But they're only a little part of the soil food web, so there's more to come. And I always tell people, be careful, because now we're going to be talking about things with stingers and biters. And the way we take a look at these things is by making that Berlese funnel, which I have out of place on my talk. You take a bottle, you cut it in half, you put the bottom inside, and then you put a little screen down around the neck, and you put some soil in, and a little light system on top of it, and the heat from the light pushes the light down into this little cup, the bottom of the pop bottle, and you look at it, and depending on what you have in there, you can figure out how your soil food web is doing. So really some scary stuff, again, if you're squeamish about putting your hands in. So you get things like this. And when you say things like this, then you can figure out what your soil food web is really like. For example, that big thing in the middle is called a japagid. See the little things on the back of it? Boy, you wouldn't want to run into that little guy. That little guy runs through the soil, as all of these other guys do, incidentally, making tunnels which create more, physicality for the soil, more structure for the soil, so that when they're running down and they're eating and they're breeding and they're killing each other, and the rain comes in and the rain goes into those tunnels and pushes the bad air out and blah, blah, blah. So you've got things like these fulcrum springtails there and mites and all these kinds of things you find down and you identify what they are. No, nobody knows what they are, because up until a couple of years ago, there were no books that you could buy that would help you identify what's in the soil. But there is now a guy named James Nardi, who used to be, and he probably still is, a professor at the University of Southern Illinois, wrote a book, James Nardi, and the book is basically his illustrations of soil animals, and you can identify what you have in your soil. And once you can identify what's in the soil, you can read about them right in his book, and they tell you what they're eating. And you can work your way down to fungus or bacteria. So if you have a lot of springtails in your soil, these are mites. Mites happen to eat both bacteria and fungi, depending on what kind of mites that you have, and you can learn to tell the difference. These springtails eat fungi. So if you've got them in your lawn has a lot of fungi. And that's a good thing, because your lawn needs some fungi. They have that little fulcrum. They can pop up that little fulcrum and jump 10 feet when they're disturbed. Lots of different kinds of these guys. Again, who would know unless you had a book like Nardi's to be able to identify them? But lots of different kinds. They're in the soil in different levels. They're all blind, and they're all eating fungus. And they're all making tunnels and pore spaces. So when the rain comes, it pushes the bad air out and pulls in the good air and acts as reservoirs and blah, blah, blah. And it's an incredible war zone down there. Things are eating each other like crazy. They're killing each other, and some of the things they kill stay there and put carbon into the soil, and they're running around and, again, making pore spaces and doing it's an eat or be eaten world down there. And so you've got, crickets getting eaten by spiders. You've got mites eating, whiteflies and aphids, and you've got the evil Karl Rove bugs. No, these are rove beetles. Ants running around in the soil. We all know what they do. They bring material down into the soil, organics. And those organics, they farm and they grow fungi on them. They make burrows. They make nests. They bring in, they create this ultrastructure in the soil. Again, water comes in, reservoir, bad air, good air, pushed out, all that good stuff. It's incredible. You've got things like sow beetles. These are actual crustaceans. They come from the sea originally, and they have to be wet all the time, so they circulate their urine in their bodies at all times so that they can stay wet. And if you've got these in your soil, then you can be sure you've got copper, which is one of the essential elements that you need for flowering in your soil. My goodness gracious, they like copper so much and need it so much, they eat their own poop in order to conserve the copper that's in the system. Spiders, they're part of the soil food web. They keep predators, they are predators, they keep things in check. So, the numbers stay where they're supposed to be. They're covered with spores and act like taxi cabs. If you want to know what else you've got in your garden soil food web, you take a handful of duff, you throw it into a bucket of water, and you see what floats up to the top. And you get all sorts of things, again, which you can identify using Nardi. Worms, a key part of the soil food web. Now, worms are absolutely amazing. Could give the whole lecture on worms. They're blind. They don't like light. They come out when it rains because, they don't want to get drowned, and they're absolutely spectacular. They make burrows in the soil where the good air, blah, 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 and they bring in tremendous amounts of organic material. And when you think about it, they have no eyes and no hands, and yet there are these beautiful studies. If you took an umbrella and tried to pull it into the ground backwards, it's not going to go. It has to be pointed in down so that it can fold up. Same thing with a leaf. How do these blind, no-handed worms flip the leaf around in order to be able to pull it back into the ground? And when they eat, they're not eating that leaf for the leaf. They only need a couple of protozoa and some of the bacteria, maybe a little fungi that's in the leaf. So they're just going for the microbes. They're not going for the heavy-duty stuff. Now, worms are not natural to the United States of America. They were wiped out by the glaciers, except in little bits down there by Arizona in the southwest. And they didn't exist in Alaska when I first got there. We didn't have worms. Now, I knew what worms were, but we didn't have worms. And as a garden columnist, I get columns, I get questions. And all of a sudden, about 20 years ago, I started getting questions from people. What are these black little things in my lawn, and how do I get rid of them? People had no idea that they were worms, and that those are worm castings, and that worm castings are some of the best things you could possibly have to grow anything, because worm castings contain higher concentrations of the nutrients that go in the worm. So when it comes out of the worm, they're heavily concentrated, and that's why vermicompost is so valuable to people who garden or farm. Now, everything's part of the soil food web. This is slime mold. When I wrote the book, I'd never seen slime mold. It looks like vomit. And I was sitting at the University of West Virginia, and I was in the parking lot waiting to go into the hotel. It was raining too hard for me to go out. And by the time it finished raining and I got out, I walked through the parking lot, there was this vomit stuff everywhere. I had no idea what it was until it suddenly dawned on me, you're here to give a talk about the soil food web. That is what you haven't ever seen before. And sure enough, it's slime mold. These are gazillions of individual amoeba-like organisms that for some reason, nobody knows why, they just come together. And they form these big vomit puddles that move over different things. And so obviously they're eating something. Bears. We all know what bears do in the woods. That's part of the soil food web. Now, this particular bear happens to be at my house in Anchorage, Alaska. And if you look at the window carefully, you'll notice it's open. There's a screen there. And if you look very carefully at the couch, you'll see where my head was a nanosecond before my wife took this picture. I was sitting there hearing this heavy breathing, and I couldn't figure out why until I turned around and saw the bear. Now, you never know what you're going to see out of a window in Anchorage, Alaska. You might see a moose. They also poop in the woods. They walk around, they carry protozoa and stuff around with them, One time, just once, I saw a pair of palins out the window. I give the whole talk just for that joke, sorry. Beetles, very important part of the soil food web. These beetles in particular. These are dung beetles, okay? Now, dung beetles are really, really cool. They can, let me just show you. They're very, very cool. So this is a dung beetle. They roll these balls, or they make these balls out of a cow patty. And then they get on top of them and they roll them in a straight line to their burrow, where they put them in the ground. And nobody could figure out how they did this. How do they know where to go? Until 2 years ago, somebody, it might have been MIT or someplace like that, they put these little sunglasses on them. And they discovered that they actually traveled by virtue of the Milky Way. Wow, who knew? And travel they do. They can hop on a dung pile in 15 minutes, make one of those balls, and get out. Now, this particular guy, if you look closely, has little red things on him. Those little red things, see there's one over here on the edge there, and there's one over there in the front. Those red things are mites. And so when they jump into the dung pile, the mites hop off and take out the fly larvae, which are the competition. And then when the dung beetle's ready to go, come back. And he goes and he takes mites back with him, so he always carries a couple around. Unbelievable. Now, you might think, so what? So they can take out a dung pile in 15 minutes. They did not have dung beetles in Australia when they brought the convicts and cattle over there, and it was a disastrous mess. I mean, poop is hard to clean up. It's very hard to clean up. And so what they did is they sent somebody over to, Africa, and he found the right kind of dung beetles and brought them back, and this is what Australia looks like today, the dung beetle works. I have a friend in Oregon who actually has a dung beetle ranch, and he ships dung beetles around the world. If you don't have them in your ranch in Ohio, your farm in Ohio, you're in trouble. And they have dung beetle collection days in a lot of places in the world where people go out and collect dung beetles and then spread them around. They're very, very important. Birds, part of the soil food web. Every time they touch the ground, protozoa is deposited. They're covered, with different things, spores and whatnot. They're taxi cabs. They might fly around with a little insect or a worm in their mouth and see another bird they want to speak to and drop it. So they travel all over the place. By the way, if you are really into, uncaged, living free chickens to eat, follow one around sometime and see what they really do eat. Ugh. Anyway, we're all part of the soil food web, even us. Okay? We're a big part of the soil food web. We're a major, major part of the soil food web. And one of the reasons is because we use things like Miracle-Gro. Now, I'm going to pick on Miracle-Gro. I'm one of the only people in the country, I think, who's allowed to do so for reasons you're about to find out. And the reason why I can do this is because of this picture. Now, I showed you before, we eat plastic. Margarine is basically plastic. Horace Hagedorn, the founder of Miracle-Gro, actually graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in, I guess, 1950s, early 50s. And he went to work for a butter company in New York. And he went to work for this butter company, and when he got there, really excited, young graduate, advertising business, madman, all that kind of stuff. He discovered that all butter is exactly the same. It's all USDA grade A. The only difference is the packaging. And he said, oh my gosh, I could have gone and worked for Gillette, and I came and worked for this butter company? Well, he came and talked to the Garden Writers of America after he had founded Miracle-Gro. And he told us that when he was working for this company, he just hated the job. He couldn't stand it. And he would go home at night, and he'd want to kill himself. He'd wake up in the morning, and he'd want to shave with a Gillette and cut himself, kill himself right there. But he didn't want to, he was a nice guy, didn't want to mess up the sink for somebody to clean up. He'd drive to work. He'd think about driving into another car. Wow. But he didn't want to kill anybody else, just himself. It was such a bad job, he thought. So on the weekends, he drove around, and one weekend, he came upon a greenhouse in New Jersey, and there was a guy named Otto Stern there, and Otto Stern's plants were spectacular. And Horace, being the guy that he was, he said, gee, maybe you and I can go into business. How do you do this? And he goes, well, I got a secret formula. And Horace says, I can advertise that. And so they tried by putting an ad in the New York Herald Tribune, I think, in 1952, before and after Miracle-Gro ad. And sure enough, he'd made $20,000, he told us, by the following Thursday. $20,000 was more than he was getting paid by the butter company. So he went into the butter company and he said, I like you guys, but I hate this business, and I don't like butter. I quit, and I'm going to become, a guy that sells fertilizer. So he continued telling us the story. He went out, he started this business with Otto. He put these ads in the paper. One day he gets a phone call about 20 years later from Scott's. Scott says, we're going to buy you out. And he goes, no, you're not. And they go, yes, we are. And by the time they had their meeting, Horace had amassed the ability to turn around using his own stock and buy Scott's lawn company, which he did for $360 million. Anyway, we were pretty impressed, and he's a fairly short guy, was a fairly short guy. He passed away several years ago. And so at the end, he'd given us all a little box of Miracle-Gro, and he told us, come on up and get an autograph. So we all went up to get autographs, and I'm a little taller than a lot of the other garden writers. I'm in the back, and he looks up, and he goes, uh-oh, is your name Lowenfels? And I go, yes. And he goes, I am so sorry I told those stories about the butter company, which my father and grandfather owned. So while he was there, one of the things he did was he put my picture on the margarine package. So that's me. It's still on the package. If you go to New York, if you're in New York, you can find this Happy Boy margarine. And I got to tell you, I got a lot of grief as a kid growing up. And so if they want to sue me, I think the jury's going to be on my side. Anyway, the thing about Miracle-Gro is the stuff is unbelievable. It works because it's so heavily concentrated that just a teeny little bit of it has to touch the roots. The rest of it, goes down into the water system and down to the Mississippi Delta. Gardeners, incidentally, use 4 times more nitrogen than farmers. So when you look at that, picture of the delta down there, and you're a gardener, you've got to be thinking you contributed to that. But the stuff works. There's no question about it. But it works because it's a chemical, oh my gosh, it did it again. It's a chemical salt, and the process in which it works is important, for the way plants work. Because if you learned anything in high school biology, you learn that nature loves an equilibrium. So if you take a pile of salt and you put it next to a single cell organism that's full of water, the salt moves into the organism and the water from the organism moves out into the salt. They want to dilute each other. And they do come pretty close. There's always one molecule difference. But you know what happens? You end up with a nice dilution, but you also end up with a dead single-cell organism. It's not just Miracle-Gro, it's all these things. And so instead of having this, where you've got that single fungal hyphae, you have this, where the nematode can get into the tomato root. Because you've destroyed the bottom of the soil food web. And if you do that by using chemicals, well, what happens? Well, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, last I checked, they're not that fond of getting, destroyed by salt. You end up with these mycorrhizal fungi I'm about to talk about not forming their association. Now, they form an association and feed 96% of all plants. And you end up with them not being there. And if they're not there, the carbon they produce is not there, and the foods that they bring to the plant, nitrogen, copper, iron, all of this stuff, phosphorus, doesn't get to the plant unless you feed it. And so when you look at the labels of these things, you've got to apply Miracle-Gro every 2 weeks. Why? Because you become the bottom of the soil food web that you've destroyed by various things that you've done. And so you have to use the stuff constantly. And, it's bad. It causes some problems. There's no question it works. But it works at the expense of the plant. You end up with dependency on Miracle-Gro. You end up with diseases because you've destroyed a lot of the things that would protect the plant, And then you have to start using pesticides because who wants to eat an apple with a flaw in it? That's not the only crazy thing we do to the soil food web. We use some pretty cockamamie chemicals, and we do it in some pretty cockamamie ways. I mean, if you want to put chemical on a plant, put it on the plant. Don't put it in the air, on your body and everything else. I guarantee you this lady died of breast cancer a couple of years after that picture was taken, without question. I mean, what were they thinking? And then we do things like rototill. Now, I used to say rototilling was a guy thing. If you live in Anchorage, Alaska, you rent a rototiller every single year and rototill your garden. Sometimes you rent it twice. I don't know how you do it down here. But in Anchorage, nobody owns their own rototiller because you only use it 2 times a year. And so what you do is you go and you rent it from Steffen's Tool Rental, and you tell, everybody, I'm going to rototill today. It's a Saturday. You go get the rototiller. You have it for 4 hours because you get it for half a day. You've already spent an hour going to get it. And so you get it, and you get into the garden, and rototilling is fun. If you're a guy, rototilling is that motorcycle your wife won't let you have, It's the big engine, and you're there, And so you rototill this way, straight, and then you rototill back. So you do that maybe an hour. God, I got a couple more hours. So then you go, diagonal, and go. And by the time you finish, you say to the wife, "Hey, I'm taking this rototiller back. Don't touch the garden. Don't go in the garden. Don't let the dog out. Don't let the kids go in the garden. You can put your arm in the soil down empty. It's so fluffy and beautiful." You take the thing back, and as you're driving home, it starts to rain. Oh, God. Or it rains hard maybe. What's happening? The air that you've fluffed into that garden is getting pushed out. The worms that you've cut in half, when you cut a worm in half with a rototiller, you don't get 2 worms. Unless you cut it on the 18th segment, you get 2 halves of a dead worm. The bacteria that's supposed to be here is down there. Those actinomycetes, which are supposed to be a little bit deeper, are now up on top. And the fungal network, that mycelium which you threw out, is completely destroyed. But you've got a nice fluffy garden that you can plant in real easily. And you've been told you have to rototill. And so, everybody does. And farmers, if it's not rototilling, it's deep plowing. And everybody does it. It's crazy. Well, one of the reasons why everybody, and then you come home, and God forbid anybody's walked in the garden. You don't even want to walk in yourself. It's just so fluffy and beautiful, Now, the reason why we rototill is because of this guy. This is Jethro Tull. No, actually, this isn't Jethro Tull, but the song is Jethro Tull, but let me see. That's Jethro Tull, right. And Jethro Tull was a lawyer like I. And he believed, like most people, he inherited a nice big piece of property. Unfortunately, I didn't. He believed, like most of the people in the day who were scientific, that in fact, plants ate soil. So why not just pulverize the hell out of it and make it easier for them to eat? And that's where rototilling came from. Now, this guy lived during the time of what are known as the American founding gardeners. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin. These guys were gardeners. They were farmers. Ben Franklin. They were all into this stuff. And they read his papers. And they believed him. And it worked. When we rototilled here in the United States and broke up, what were we doing? We were breaking up old growth forests, fungally dominated, in order to be able to grow row crops, which require bacterially dominated soil. So it made a lot of sense, and it worked. We broke it all up. We returned the soil back into a bacterial, mishmash. But we continued to rototill every year since. And in fact, it turns out you don't need to, because what happens is the soil begins to develop these anaerobic pockets. God forbid you should get some ice and snow in a place like Anchorage, Alaska. Whoosh, all the air squeezed out of the garden. And when you get anaerobic pockets, you get the production of alcohol. 1 part per million touching a root kills cells. Now, there are anaerobic pockets throughout your soil. And when you rototill, you get many, 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 many more of them. And what happens? The bad guys, the opportunistic bad guys, take the opportunity and come forward. And one day you wake up after many years of gardening with no problems whatsoever to a terrible case of toilet paper flipperoporus. And you go, what the hell happened here? Where did this come from? Forget that you have a 16-year-old daughter. But anyway, you go, maybe to Lowe's or True Value or to, Hard, and you ask the genius there, the college graduate chemist, what do I use on my garden to get rid of toilet paper flipperoporus? Well, he doesn't know, so he asks the supervisor, and she doesn't know. You can find these places in these stores by yourself, blindfolded. You walk in, you can smell where they're located. And of course, you buy what you need, and then you read the label, suit up, and spray. Nobody ever does this. Most people never read the label. Most people don't realize that most of these labels require a razor blade, not to mention bifocals, where you open it up, so you can read the whole label. You get this stuff and you use it. And because you're a gardener and you're a smart person, you don't need anybody's help, or a farmer. You just spray it on. And if you live in a place like Anchorage, Alaska that has a really short season, my God, I better put it on twice because I want it to really work quickly. And of course, you hit the beneficials as well as the bad guys. And it's a slippery slope, and things get worse and worse, and pretty soon you have to develop a very special strategy in order to be able to figure out how to survive. It's just that simple. And we spray our food because we don't want blemishes. Whoa, man, and then we worry about our lawns. Incidentally, Google lawns, dogs, Long Island, some fascinating cancer stuff. But our lawns, come on. What about our kids and our school fields and everything? My goodness gracious. Now, I went to a different school. I went to Harvard, but this guy is Yale. I don't care. I still believe him, right? There's no question that these things are bad for kids, period. No question, no UN needed. Nobody needs to be told this. But we still can buy them. We wonder why 1 in 9 women has breast cancer. I can tell you that I gave my wife breast cancer. I'm convinced I gave my wife breast cancer. I've been writing a garden column in the Anchorage Daily News for 41 years without ever missing a week because they put your picture in the paper when you're not there. To me, that always said, he's not there, rob his house. So I always have a column. Anyway, during the time I've written my column, and I'm still writing it, about 14 different chemicals have been removed from the market that I was recommending people use before 1996 when I made my conversion. They were removed from the market voluntarily by the companies. One of them was a product called Saigon 2E. The Rose Society of America was where I learned about it. They would take it, and I would take it, and tell my readers to take it, and put it around your plant that has aphids, whether it's a rose or a birch tree. And there were years in Anchorage, Alaska, where you would see these dark, 6-inch stripes around every birch tree in Anchorage, Alaska, where people put the Saigon 2E, a systemic, that killed the aphids. One time, I put the stuff into a styrofoam cup. I went to get the paintbrush, and the styrofoam cup was gone. I gave my wife breast cancer. Don't use chemicals, period. All right, anyway, there's no question in my mind. And you know what happens? Eventually you get to the point where even the moose are on their knees praying that you stop doing this. I don't want to offend anybody, but I have to do this because it's my sense of humor. These are Muslims. I'm sorry. I try to be an equal opportunity offender. I hope I didn't offend anybody. You know, some things are just so obvious that they just don't require signs. You know what I mean? Ski in the winter. Of course you ski in the winter, not in the summertime. Anyway, it's the same thing. You know what I mean? We can figure this out. It's pretty simple. The signs are all there. And the answer is this. You put the microbes back again. Simple as that. And there's really easy ways to do it. The first way is you can use compost. The second way is you can use compost tea, both of which could be made fungally dominated or bacterially dominated. Or you can use mulches, which can be either fungally attractive or bacterially attractive. Or you can use endo, in the right situations, and ectomycorrhizal fungi. So very quickly I'm going to go through these. Let's see. In Seattle, you have to compost. If you don't compost, you got to move to Portland or someplace else. Simple as that. And the reason compost is so good is because it contains, as I said before, the bacteria and the nematodes, which are the fertilizer bags, and the fertilizer spreaders, the protozoa and the nematodes, and the fungi, excuse me. Simple as that. Oh, I got that all mixed up, but you get the point. That's why compost is so good. It's got all of the soil food web base there. And then probably more. You know, it's got the worms and all these terrific things. You just need a little teeny bit of it. You put just 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch down on the ground, and in about 8 months, 6 months, its microbiology is 18 inches down into the soil. Now, there are some problems with compost. One is you've got to have a spouse that's willing to turn the pile. That's kind of basic. My wife hates this picture. She thinks people are going to recognize her. If you have a big place, a big farm, you got to use a lot of compost, and you have to know where your compost comes from. Simple as that. If the horse from the farmer that you get your manure from is using the wrong kind of herbicide, when you use the compost, your nightshade plants aren't going to do very well. Tomatoes, potatoes, they're just not going to grow well because the pesticide is still in the compost even though it's gone through the composting process. Tetracycline, if it's not good compost, will still be in whatever you bought. So you got to know where it comes from if you don't make it yourself. Worm or vermicompost, again, we've mentioned this. This is why it's so good. It's so highly concentrated in goodies. Wow, terrific stuff. And they make it for you. A pound of worms will take a pound of food wastes and convert them every single day. For about 4 months, we had a worm bin in my living room until my wife found out that's what it was. Now it's just off the living room in the greenhouse, and she's the biggest user of it, I have to add. And when you use compost, your gardens are spectacular because there's the diversity and the numbers to keep almost every single thing in check in your garden. The best gardeners in the world are compost gardeners. And wow, it's so sustainable. It makes so much sense. All right. So, compost is terrific. Again, you can make it fungally dominated or bacterially dominated by putting in slightly different amounts of brown versus green. But it doesn't stick to leaves. So, what we've come up with is something called compost tea. Somewhat controversial, I don't really know why. I've been using it for years and years and years. There are lots of different compost tea makers. Compost tea, you take the compost, you put it into water, you add energy. Remember, you got to really brush hard to get that. And the energy happens to be air bubbles, and they strip out, or water current, they strip out the fungi and the bacteria and the nematodes and the protozoa, and you add foods to it to feed them. And if you want bacterially dominated, one kind of food, and if you want fungally dominated, another kind of food. And after 24 to 48 hours, you have a brew of soil food web microbes that you can use in your yard and garden or farm. Simple as that. Very easy. You can buy your own compost tea in Anchorage, Alaska, and lots of other places where they're starting to use it. New York, Oregon, Washington, California. It's moving throughout the country. Or you make your own, or you can do something called compost extracting, where you take the compost and you put it into a bag, a cheesecloth, and you knead it for 15 minutes in water. Now, you're not multiplying the bacteria and the fungi, but you're stripping them out, and it works pretty darn good. So you can use that as well, and you can spray it on the leaves, and what happens is it outcompetes the bad guys for space, for food, and for location. So you cover the stomata. You outcompete the bad guys. It's not an eyeside, it's an outcompeter. Does it work? Very controversial. Here's some before and after pictures. And the reason why it's controversial is because it's hard to duplicate compost and compost tea, et cetera, et cetera. This is South Africa. Compost tea, no compost tea. If you look in the back there, that's Dr. Elaine Ingham's old office. You can see where the compost tea was not used. These are the roses at the Shed Aquarium a couple of years ago where they were experimenting, and those are potatoes from potato land someplace. But this is one of my favorite pictures. This is John Evans and his wife Mary. He has about 17 Guinness Book of Records, and he grows big cabbages and big vegetables. And the reason why I show this picture is he's a soil food webby big time. That's all he uses, compost and compost tea. That's a 27-pound leek. If you look over here at the zucchini, that particular zucchini weighed, I think, 49 pounds. And I took it down to the Seattle Northwest Flower and Garden Show from Anchorage. And of course, I flew Alaska Airlines because I'm loyal to my airline, and they only allow 50 pounds per bag. So I had to have his own bag. So when I got it to this show, I opened up the bag, and there is the little TSA card. We've been through your luggage, blah, blah, blah. And stapled to it was a little note that said, "Holy shit." Don't mean to offend. That's a pretty big zucchini. When I cut it open, it was as beautiful as you can possibly imagine. Unreal. Absolutely incredible. This is the capper, however. Because there's a lady up in Washington State who really hates compost tea and claims that we're all charlatans and everything else. This is a guy named Lee Fleischer in the beret over there on the right, talking to a woman named Faust, who happens to be president of Harvard University. They're looking at a compost tea machine that was just purchased by Harvard University, one of several that they now own. And T. Fleischer did his thesis up there, a master's thesis on compost tea using Harvard Yard. And today, it was so successful, when you park your car in Harvard Yard, you're parking your car on a compost tea yard. And in fact, it was so successful that Harvard instituted a campus-wide, worldwide campus-wide composting program in order to be able to feed their composting machines. Because what you really want to use is indigenous stuff if you can. You take healthy microbes from your own area and you use them right in your own area. And so Harvard uses compost tea. So does the University of Colorado, New York Botanical Gardens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's absolutely spectacular stuff, and I highly, highly recommend it. Now, you can also use mulches. And again, some mulches are bacterial attractants and some are fungal attractants. If they're green, they are bacterial. Straw is green. It's got a lot of sugars on it, incidentally, and coated with paramecium, which I'll talk about in a second. And brown tend to be fungal. Fungi break down the brown stuff. So it's real easy. And what falls down from a plant's supposed to stay on the ground. Now, we come along and we pick up fruits and we pick up leaves, because I don't know why we pick up leaves, but we do. And we shouldn't, because this is how plants feed themselves. There are no bare soils in nature. So there was a question this morning about mulches. Of course you should be using mulch. because that's what nature does. And if you use green mulches, you get nitrates. And if you use brown mulches, you get ammoniums. And you can feed the plants what they need. All right, now let's take a look at mycorrhizal fungi, which again, I think are so important. And I think there's no question in my mind, these are the next thing in agriculture. And that includes horticulture and gardening. There are 2 kinds that we care about out of the 7 that we know of, ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal fungi. These are the 7 different kinds. I should tell you that orchids, for example, can't even germinate unless the mycorrhizal fungi is there. That's how important they are. I'll go one step further. The reason we have plants on the planet Earth is because of mycorrhizal fungi. 400 million years ago, these fungi associated with what became land plants. And that's why we have trees and shrubs and whatnot. And then a second kind, about 200 million years ago, associated with other kinds of plants. And today, 90 to 96% of all plants have a relationship with a mycorrhizal fungi, simple as that. When I asked garden writers in 1996 how many people had ever heard of a mycorrhizal fungi, not one single one raised their hands. There were 795 of them in the room, ranging from the New York Times, Seattle paper. I'm sure there was somebody from Florida there too. Nobody had ever heard of them. Well, it's pretty interesting because they are so darn important. Again, these 2 kinds are the key. The reason why we haven't heard of them is really twofold. One is they were really sort of discovered during the late 1800s when the fungicide industry was being developed, and it won. And 2, because they were fungus, people were afraid of them. They thought they were pathogens. And so they didn't study them properly. And it really wasn't until the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into 2000s that we were even able to grow them, so that we could study them the right way. And they are absolutely unbelievable. This is very important because they are so important. And you will be hearing these words. Mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal is the adjective. Mycorrhiza is the relationship that they form with a single fungus. Mycorrhizae is the plural, so when they form several relationships. So those are the terms, and here's how they work. So you get a fungi, a mycorrhizal fungi, and it's getting exudates from a plant, and the plant, wants to be fed, and so the fungi becomes active. This is a fungi, and if you look down at the bottom, you see that little white thing that's developing as it goes up to the top. The active fungi is becoming more active as it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. That's called a Spritzenkörper. The Germans are really into this stuff. Mycorrhizal is a word that the German developed. They discovered these things. The Spritzenkörper is nothing more than the command center. And it tells the fungi, bring up molecules from the back. We got to make the cell wall longer because we got to go turn left because we're going to go get a Milky Way. Or if you're in English, you go get a Milky Bar. And so you go find where they are, and there's these beautiful internet films that show fungi just traveling like this, and then all of a sudden you put food here, and wow, at 40 centimeters a minute, unbelievable speed as they rush towards their food. They get their food, they drop the acid out. The acid breaks down the food so that it digests, and by breaking down the food, it breaks it down. It leaves stuff there for those bacteria and archaea to break down, and then it absorbs the stuff and takes it up through the system, and then it transfers it to the plant. Some of it keeps, but most of it transfers. Absolutely unbelievable. And I don't know why I have this in here twice, but I guess it's kind of important, so I'll show it again. Thank goodness I only have it twice. Now, the ectomycorrhizal fungi are the ones that associate with trees, basically, and they form this very special net. See all that little black and white stuff in that little diagram there? This stuff you're looking at that's golden, that's the fungal net that forms around the fungi. You're looking at roots that are coated with mycorrhizal fungi. The mycorrhizal fungi not only feed the plant, but they make it difficult for bad guys to get into the plant. It'd be tough for a nematode to get through that cottony mycorrhizal fungi and get there. What you're looking down here at the bottom is a ponderosa pine. Look at the coating of mycorrhizal fungi. Changes the morphology of the roots. They become shorter and stubbier. And what does the work is the fungi. So these are these are trees that take ectomycorrhizal fungi, and ectomycorrhizal fungi always form a fruiting body that you can see. It's either a mushroom or a truffle. Not all mushrooms are mycorrhizal, but many of the ones that you see are. So for example, in Anchorage, Alaska, we have the Alice in Wonderland mycorrhizal fungi. We have Amanita muscaria, that beautiful red and white poisonous mushroom from which Santa Claus was derived. You know the one I'm talking about? You've all seen pictures of it. It's red. It's got these little white warts on it. Highly psychedelic. You take a bite of that, and you are flying like crazy until you die 5 minutes later. But what they used to do is the Russian witch doctors shamans, they would go and follow around caribou that were eating these things. And they would drink the caribou piss. And then they would urinate themselves, and the entire village would drink portions of the shaman's urine, and they would all get high, and nobody would die. But not something that I recommend. However, if you don't have those particular mushrooms around your birch trees in Anchorage, Alaska, your birch trees are dying. Simple as that. Because these are the guys that bring in food for the plant. And what kind of food do they bring in? Phosphorus in particular, nitrogen, copper, zinc, all sorts of stuff they bring into the plant and feed it. Now, the other kind, the endo, are also called vesicular arborescular mycorrhizal because they form these microscopic tree-like structures, arbor structures. They're very, very hard to see unless you stain them. And oh my gosh, I did it again. Unless you stain them, and let's go, come on. Yeah, there's a stained one, so there they are. And they form these little vesicles, which is in between the cells, or in the cells, it's sort of an area where the transfer takes place, and they contain water. And so during drought situations, that water is available to the plant. Endo, ecto. Whoops, and mistako. Simple as that. All right, now this is a true partnership, okay? And it's one of those ones where size really does make a big difference. And here's why. Because what happens with a plant is the plant grows into the soil, and a zone develops around the side of the plant called the depletion zone, where it's taken in all the goods that it's gotten in the soil. All right, and it either grows further, deeper into the soil to get new stuff, or it can just give a couple of exudates out there, and a mycorrhizal fungi comes, associates with it, and because they're so small, they can go out beyond the depletion zone into these pore spaces and get the goodies that the plant needs and bring it back to the plant. Remember, they don't bring back the goodies, the plant goes, no food for you. So this is a true relationship. They are working for each other. This is a celery plant. There is the mycorrhizal fungi that's going out and getting the goods that make that celery plant taste great. Because if you're using Miracle-Gro, that mycorrhizal fungi is not there, and that celery is going to taste like what? Miracle-Gro. In a teaspoon of soil that supports wheat, for example, there are 3 miles of invisible fungal hyphae going out and getting that wheat what it needs. 3 miles. And look how they reach out and extend the reach of that plant. They are absolutely incredible. 90 to 95% of the plants, or 96% of the plants, the ones that generally don't use mycorrhizal fungi are the ones your kids don't like to eat. Cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, that family. So they don't like those. And oddly enough, they don't like this family, which includes Amaranthus. The guy that sells 90% of the mycorrhizal fungi in the world is named Michael Amaranthus, which is kind of funny. But all right, anyway, they are propagated as spores or pieces of fungi, propagules, and this is what they look like. And you put them into different kinds of mixtures. There are about 350 or so that we've identified. We can only produce about 15 of them. Fortunately, they sleep around, so they're not specific to one single plant usually. Although one particular kind can be for a singular plant. Now, they come in powder forms, which are mixed in. Now there's a liquid form which was developed about 3 or 4 years ago, so you can put it down on existing plants. The other plants, you have to roll it in or get it close to the root. They have to get the signal from the root before they'll germinate and form the relationship. So they can't be out in nowhere. And they don't exist in compost because there's no plants there to feed them. So you have to add them in situations like that. And here's how they work. So you've got these two seedlings sitting out in the sun. One of them says, hey, you know what? I would like some duck. So what does it do? It goes and mixes up the right exudate, puts that exudate into the soil. The next thing you know, it catches the fungi. The fungi goes out and gets the duck for the plant. Simple as that. And once it's there, it stays there feeding the plant because it's getting exudates and the plant gets bigger. And what's really cool is when you put two of them next to each other, they share mycorrhizal fungi. And what we're learning now is that in the forest, all of the mycorrhizal fungi are feeding all sorts of different plants. When the big mother plant tree dies, the mycorrhizal fungi goes down not to other necessarily baby plants of the same species, but to other plants in the forest that aren't even related. Wow, to keep the forest healthy. Paul Stamets, who's the world's expert on this stuff, Mycelium Running, highly recommend the book, and anything else Paul does, I might add. Wow. I mean, these are like a big computer system underground, keeping, it's mind-boggling, it's phenomenal. Do they work? Well, yeah, they work. Here's some before and after pictures. Or I should say with and without pictures. I'll show you some more in a minute, but I have to tell you that the endo in particular produce a substance called glomalin, which was discovered in 1996 by the USDA, one of the good things it's done. And glomalin, which is pronounced two different ways, is a glycoprotein. It's got two carbon sources on it, so this is what it looks like stained. It has a tremendous amount of carbon in it. And it is produced by mycorrhizal fungi and put out into the soil. Now, this glomalin gives rigidity to the fungi, it solidifies the filaments, and it seals gaps in the fungi so that it doesn't leak out. And what this enables it to do is to grow throughout the garden, and create this network underneath your farm or garden, whatnot, of carbon. Because it puts 30 to 38% of the carbon into the soil. We used to think it all came from humic acids. No, it comes from mycorrhizal fungi. And when these mycorrhizal fungi are killed off, you're not getting carbon additions to your soil the way you should be. In fact, you're losing carbon. This is one of the reasons why this stuff is important, because carbon in the soil, sequestered in the soil, is where you want it, not in a greenhouse gas. Mycorrhizal fungi are absolutely crucial. And when they die, because they don't live forever, but branches do, it lives on, but parts of it die off, that carbon stays in the soil. It's there for other organisms to eat. And, as I indicated, water is held by these mycorrhizal fungi. And so in Illinois 3 years ago during the big drought, those that used the mycorrhizal fungi they got from Dr. Michael Amaranthus had a crop. And those that didn't. This is the difference in some of the tests that Michael did. Unbelievable difference just by using these mycorrhizal fungi. Before and after, or which one has, which one doesn't. It's pretty easy to tell. They are unbelievable. Now, the co-author of the first book, Teaming with Microbe, Wayne Lewis, he became so enamored with mycorrhizal fungi, he uses it so heavily. You should see his yard. Yowzer. Unbelievable stuff. Look at the difference. Just using mycorrhizal fungi. More roots, which means better soil structure, much more carbon. Before and after, before and after, before and after, with and without, I guess I should say. And these things increase the strength of the plant as well. Remember, I mentioned that they have that chitin in the cell wall. Well, that chitin becomes involved in that heart. It becomes involved in all of the the mycorrhizal fungi inside the plant, and it becomes difficult for a nematode because they don't eat chitin. They make the plant stronger. They protect things, And again, as I say, drought tolerance. That's the water. You can see where all those little vesicles are, and just that little teeny root, that's a lot of water. Unbelievable difference in root growth, structure. One of the things that's going on, however, is because we are now able to, and I was so glad to see in the movie today, this morning, we're now able to identify on a DNA level, individual genes, et cetera, what we thought was one kind of fungus turns out to be, when we do the analysis, DNA analysis or RNA analysis, a different kind. So now they're renaming all of these, which means that every single label out there right now is wrong. And so they're all in the process of being relabeled and renamed. This one, Glomus interestites, is a very, very important one. It grows a lot of vegetables, cannabis, lots of different things. The name's just been changed. Used to be Glomus mos. So you got to keep an eye on that stuff. That's being developed. It increases nitrogen fixation. When you have a mycorrhizal association with the same plant, you get more nodules of nitrogen fixation. Incredible. And I have to say, it is the subject of one of the most fascinating books I have ever read in my life. So you're going to want to get that later on. Just a couple of more minutes so that I explain to you. When you're a soil food webby, you do things differently. And I suspect most of the people that are listening today and most of the people that are here today are people that do things differently. We don't use pesticides because you don't need them. You have diversity and numbers, and you have stronger plants, so you don't need them. And you can tolerate a couple of bugs. You might even be able to eat a couple of them. They're not bad for us. We use beneficials wherever we possibly can. We take advantage of nature. Nature rules, nature controls, nature knows what's going on. Nature has been doing this for 400 million years with plants. We are feeding the microbes, not the plants. So we're using microbe food, not fertilizer. And it comes in all sorts of forms. And there's a philosophical and a moral difference between using the stuff that we use and the stuff that was used to blow up Oklahoma City and Europe and ammunitions, etc. Comes in all sorts of forms, usually fish and poop. You can even find fish and poop. What I tell people to do is, geez, why not just skip the hassle? Why go to the poop? Go to the stuff that makes the poop. You don't have to feed the animal. You can use the stuff they eat. All of that stuff turns out to be terrific microbe food. And you can use it and save a big step and a tremendous amount of energy by using the feeds rather than using the animal poops themselves. You want to keep the phosphorus numbers very low. If you're using phosphorus in your fertilizer or your manure has too much phosphorus in it, it turns out the plant will not form an association with the mycorrhizal fungi, one of the things in the third book. You got to keep those numbers below 10, 10, 10, and as low as you possibly can. And in fact, you'll find out you really don't even need the phosphorus if you've got the mycorrhizal fungi, because that's what they do. They go out and get phosphorus. So when we're reaching peak phosphorus, when you buy lawn food this year, no phosphorus will be in it. That middle number will be 0 on all lawn food in the United States of America. So you want to keep that low, and let's see, you don't want to rototill, because if you rototill once, that's okay. But after that, you don't need to. You know, things will grow up through cement. We've all seen it. We've all seen things growing up through pavement in your driveway. They don't need you to rototill to grow. They're growing to get to light. They'll get there. But you want that carbon. And when you rototill or destroy your fungal setup, you're losing carbon. That's bad for the environment, and that's bad for your garden. These are things that will feed bacteria. So if you want to have bacterially dominated microbe foods, microbes, that's what you feed. These are the things that you can feed for fungi. You can make some pretty interesting things like a protozoa tea kit by taking hay, straw, which is coated with protozoa. You put it in water, stir it a couple of times a day, and after 4 or 5 days, you've got so many protozoa in there, you can see them. You put this stuff down in the soil, and in 10 days, each one of those parameciums, which is what they are, will be eating 10,000 bacteria and pooping it right there in the root zone. Now, you can find out how your soil food web is doing by testing it. Of course, you can get nardy and read about it. You can buy a microscope. You can look for the bigger guys that eat the littler guys. This is, what I call the nardy Lowenfels method. And you can just test your plants. Now, I always tell people, if you're not convinced, and I know everybody here is, think about this. We got the redwoods. Now, the redwoods are, some of them 370 feet or taller. Some of them are 500 plus years old. How did they ever live that long and get that big without any miracle grow or any sprays being put on them? That is the ultimate question. And the simple answer is, they teamed with the soil food web without ever reading the book. But you should. Thank you very much. And we got time for 3 questions. 3 minutes a question. 2 minutes and 58. No, maybe not. Yes, quickly.
What would you recommend to compost weeds and weeds with a lot of seeds?
Right. What you want to how do you compost weeds with seeds and stuff? You just compost it like anything else, but you get it hot. It's got to be at the temperature for at least every bit of the pile, every bit. For 3 days, it's got to be up at that, 160, 159 degrees. It's got to be up there for that entire time. It will kill those seeds. What's happening is you're not getting your stuff hot enough for long enough, the seeds are living. If your seeds continue to live, more heat, and you get that by adding more green and adding more air. And you can test it by just taking some stuff and trying to grow some cilantro in it and see if the weeds come up as well. Simple as that. Yes? Yes?
About compost as well. With regards to conventionally grown fruits and vegetables, if you're putting them into your compost, is that okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I put everything in my compost I can. I try not to get poisons on them. I think your worry is that they may have some herbicides and pesticides. I've not had any problems, and I've had my stuff tested. If you're concerned, you can have it tested. Simple as that. Okay, folks, that's it. We got a couple of copies of the books next door, and everybody else's books, I might add, and film. And so Steve's going to come up and probably tell us to go on over there. Thank you very much. You're a terrific audience.